Welcome to this study of the Screwtape Letters. If you've never read the book before, I hope that these presentations will encourage you to do so. If you've already read the book, I hope these presentations will help you draw more understanding from this really important book. I want to begin by saying a few words of introduction about the Screwtape Letters, and then we'll take a look at letters 1 through 5 for this initial session. The Screwtape Letters was originally published in 1942, and so the book appeared about the same time that Lewis was doing his broadcast talks on the BBC. These talks would later become what we know now today as the book Mere Christianity. Screwtape Letters is a series of letters written by a senior devil, whose name is Screwtape, to a junior devil, a devil in training, whose name is Wormwood, and Wormwood has just been assigned to work on the damnation of a human being, who is referred to in the letters as the patient, the person being worked on. Lewis presents hell, or what he calls the lowerarchy, as an immense bureaucracy, the purpose of which is simply to feed on souls. As Lewis portrays it, hell is in a position to be unable to really create anything. It can only take in, consume, corrupt, and destroy. It can't give life. Also, the other characteristic that hell shares is that everyone in hell is very, very, very self-focused. It's a place of utter egocentricity. Contrasting with this, as Lewis makes clear, heaven is a place of life, capital L, that is life-giving, in which everyone is possessed of the ability to transcend themselves and to practice charity. They are able to get out from beyond the confines of their own egos to genuinely love God and genuinely love neighbor. The fundamental characteristic of hell, therefore, is a kind of self-absorption or self-preoccupation. And while this may not seem to be harmful or bad, Lewis wants us to see something really important here. And that is that an overabundance of self-love actually prevents genuine love of God and genuine love of neighbor. To the extent that we are preoccupied with ourselves, Lewis says, we simply cannot love God and we will not love our neighbor. Another thing that characterizes the Screwtape Letters is that Lewis presents the classical Christian view of evil. That is, as he makes clear, evil is not a positive force. It's not the opposite of heaven, for a very important reason. It can only destroy and corrupt. Hell is utterly negative. Evil is utterly negative. The very existence of evil depends upon good, of which it is the corruption. Lewis says something about this in the preface to the 1961 edition. I'll read just a brief snippet from what he says. He's talking here about the devil. Now, if by the devil you mean a power opposite to God and like God, self-existent from all eternity, the answer certainly is no. There is no uncreated being except God. God has no opposite. No being could attain a perfect badness opposite to the perfect goodness of God. For when you've taken away every kind of good thing, intelligence, will, memory, energy, existence, there is nothing left. I believe in angels, and I believe that some of these, by the abuse of their free will, have become enemies to God and, as a corollary, enemies to us. Satan, the leader or dictator of devils, is the opposite, not of God, but of Michael, the archangel. So Lewis is saying we shouldn't see the devil as simply an equal opposite of God, whether the devil is a creature as well. God alone is the creator. A final theme that runs throughout the Screwtape Letters is Lewis works over and over again to sort of help us get past the notion that somehow evil is exciting, creative, or even fun. He helps us to see that what's really involved in evil over and over is a kind of self-deception. The goal of evil is to simply consume everything beyond itself. It's utterly lacking in humor, it's utterly lacking in joy, it's utterly lacking in creativity. Now let's take a look at letters 1 through 5. The first letter has the theme of what I would call the usefulness of pseudo-intellectualism. Now remember, all these letters are advice given by Screwtape, the senior devil, to Wormwood, the junior devil, about how to destroy somebody's spiritual life. And the first lesson that he offers here is that the thing that you don't want to do as a tempter is to induce someone to genuine thought or genuine argument. What you want is pseudo-intellectualism. What you want are catchphrases. What you want is sort of a whole series of unexamined thoughts. So let's see how that works out. The first piece of advice that Screwtape offers Wormwood about how to destroy the spiritual life of his patient is he says, your best friend is jargon, not argument. And Screwtape says this: he doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic, practical, outworn, contemporary, conventional. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him out of the church. Now, we see what Screwtape is doing here. That is, his interest is not in actually enabling this guy to provide any real arguments against Christianity, but actually to arrive at the point where he simply thinks of Christianity as old-fashioned, out of date, something belonging to the past. Once again, jargon is the thing, not thought. The trouble with argument, as Screwtape notes, is, as he says, it moves the struggle to the enemy's own ground. By the very act of arguing, you awaken the patient's reason, and once it is awake, who can foresee the result? You will find that you've been strengthening in your patient that fatal habit of tending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from that stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix him on that stream. Teach him to call that real life. And don't let him ask what he means by real. Now, once again, we can see Screwtape strategy. The strategy is to avoid actual thought and to keep this guy's attention focused on his immediate stream of experience, or even better, on distractions. Keep him focused on distractions such that he comes to think of this kind of flow of sense experience as real life and anything else as being unreal or false or not important. The thing that you don't want your patient to do is to start any kind of self-examination or real thought about what's going on in his life. The letter concludes with another interesting piece of advice, and that is that Screwtape says that the real sciences are no defense against Christianity. And therefore, what Wormwood needs to do is he needs to keep his patient focused not on the results of the genuine sciences, but on loose talk about science, or the results of modern scientific investigation, or the modern scientific worldview. Something vague and ill-defined like that. Screwtape notes that actual science might lead someone to think about realities that they can't see or touch. And then he notes there have been some sad cases among modern physicists. That is, modern physicists who are dealing with things they can't see or touch all the time. And this leads them to the view that materialism really can't be true because they're dealing with things that are unseeable and untouchable all the time. And as a matter of fact, matter might really be some sort of energy when it all comes down to it. And therefore their materialism begins to crumble. So the genuine sciences aren't of any help in keeping people out of the church. What's important is kind of loose talk about the sciences or the scientific worldview. The letter concludes with this interesting and somewhat humorous piece of advice. Do remember that you are there to fuddle him. From the way that some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose that it's your job to teach. That as Screwtape says, look, your job isn't to teach this guy. Your job isn't to sort of teach him anything. Your job is to confuse, to mislead, to fuddle, to befuddle. That's how you do your job. The second letter deals with the usefulness of the church in undermining people's faith, and the advice here is interesting and worth noting. Screwtape says that when someone becomes a Christian, that doesn't mean that the devil's strategy for them somehow has failed or is now over. Here's what he says. There's no need to despair. Hundreds of these adult converts have been reclaimed after a brief sojourn in the enemy's camp and are now with us. All the habits of the patient, both mental and bodily, are still in our favor. Now, there are a couple strategies here. First, Screwtape says that Wormwood needs to direct the attention of his patient away from what the church actually is. The patient should be kept from seeing that the church is actually rooted in eternity, that it spans the whole span of time, that it is something which has been created and sustained by God and will be consummated by God, and consists of the communion of saints. All that must be kept from his attention. And his attention must be focused on the actual Christians around him, and also all of their annoying habits and idiosyncrasies. The patient has to be led to the view that the annoying habits or personality quirks or odd characteristics of any Christian must somehow indicate that their faith is not genuine. At the same time, the patient needs to be kept from any genuine self-knowledge. So you see what Screwtape is working at here. Make him hyper-aware of the faults and idiosyncrasies of the people sitting in the pews around him, and make him increasingly blind to his own faults and his own idiosyncrasies. And then he offers this piece of advice. All you have to do is to keep out of his mind the question, if I, being what I am, can consider myself in some sense a Christian, why should the different vices of those people in the next pew prove that their religion is mere hypocrisy and convention? That's the question that he's not to be allowed to ask himself. So the aim here is to make this guy blind to his own faults, but hyper-aware of the faults around him. And the results of this, from Screwtape's perspective, will be really fruitful. This guy, who's a recent convert, will experience the church as a sort of unending disappointment. And you can sort of understand why this might be, right? Someone becomes a new convert to Christianity, they join a church, and what do they expect to find? They expect to find a community of saints, of people who have have a dazzling level of holiness. Screwtape says you need to focus his attention on the fact that he's not going to find many of those people around him. But then he needs to be kept from asking the question, well, wait a minute, I'm not a dazzling saint. I haven't reached a dazzling level of holiness, and yet I'm part of the church too. So the strategy here is make sure that everyone is hyper aware of the sins of their fellow Christians and as unaware as possible of their own. And what will happen is they will increasingly experience the church as a kind of ongoing, unending disappointment. And maybe they'll eventually leave. And that's what Screwtape would like to see happen. So even the church can be used for the devil's purposes. Letter 3 has as its theme the theme of family life as a source of spiritual corruption. I think this is really an insightful letter. Now, we often think of temptation as something that's pretty obvious. That is, we all think of temptation, or tend to think of it, as temptation to do something that is like really awful and really wicked. But Screwtape makes it clear here that that's not necessarily the case. And that actually, family life is a wonderful context for temptation. Let's see how it works. The thing that Screwtape is going to focus on in this letter is what he calls the settled habit of mutual annoyance. The daily strategy here is one of kind of like daily pinpricks among people who live and work together. So here's how this works. Screwtape says, look, here's what you need to do. You need to get this guy focused on his inner life. You need to move his attention away from how he actually treats people and what he actually does, to being continually focused on how he feels at any particular moment. Here's part of the advice. Keep his mind off the most elementary duties by directing it to the most advanced and spiritual ones. Aggravate that most useful human characteristic, the horror and neglect of the obvious. You must bring him to a condition in which he can practice self-examination for an hour without discovering any of those facts about himself that are perfectly clear to anyone who has ever lived in the same house or worked with him in the same office. So the idea is a disconnect between spiritual life and actual behavior. Over-focus on spiritual life, complete neglect on actual behavior. The patient's prayer life can also be made innocuous. The patient must be directed to praying for other people in as spiritual a mode as possible, such that over time, their prayers for that person are brought further and further away from the actual state of the person for whom that they are praying. The end result here is to have everyone praying for essentially an imaginary person, not praying for that person as they actually are, and not praying for those persons' actual needs, and certainly not praying that you repent of your bad intentions or treatment of that person. In this way, prayer can be made innocuous and ineffective, as a gap is introduced once again between the prayer life and one's actual practice of life in the world. The patient must also be induced to adopt a double standard. And then this is brilliant on Screwtape's part. The double standard is this. The patient needs to be directed to that point where he adopts a double standard. Everything that he says is to be taken at its face value, whereas everything that everyone else says is to be subjected to the most oversensitive interpretation possible. And therefore, what will happen is that the patient will always find himself in a mode where he's always offended at what other people say or do. He insists that everything that he says be accepted at its face value while subjecting everything that everyone else says to the most hypersensitive interpretation possible, and thus he will always be out of sync with others and feel self-righteous about it in the process. The problem will always be with other people and never himself. Society will be corrected when other people change their ways and improve their behavior, but he'll stay the same. Hence, from every quarrel, they will both go away convinced or nearly convinced that they are quite innocent. The strategy of daily pinpricks in family, social, and work life here can serve as a wonderful field for temptation and the undermining of the Christian life, Screwtape says. The fourth letter deals with another really important theme. It's the theme of turning Christianity into a feeling. We've already seen this from the first letter. Screwtape's already made it clear that he doesn't want anyone to really think about Christianity. Now he's going to push Screwtape to push the patient to turn Christianity into a series of feelings, not actually something that's objective or real. So let's see how that works. The letter actually begins with a note of irritation, and I'll read part of that letter to you, so you can get a sense. Part of the drama of the letters is the relationship that unfolds between Screwtape and Wormwood, which actually deteriorates. So here's the way that the fourth letter opens, and here we get a hint of Screwtape's anger at Wormwood. The amateurish suggestions in your last letter warn me that it is high time for me to write to you fully on the painful subject of prayer. You might have spared the comment that my advice about his prayers for his mother proved singularly unfortunate. That is not the sort of thing that a nephew should write to his uncle, nor a junior tempter to the undersecretary of a department. There's the bureaucracy. It also reveals an unpleasant desire to shift responsibility. You must learn to pay for your own blunders. Here we'll see that essentially another characteristic of hell is everyone is always looking out for themselves and trying not to be held at fault. We'll see this drama play out. Screwtape wants the patient here to get the idea that prayer needs to be thought of as essentially a childish thing. They need to be thought about the prayers they might have prayed for a child, or some of the rote prayers they might be aware of, and to kind of associate prayer with childishness. And then they can be moved to thinking that the best kind of prayer, the most appropriate prayer, the really religious form of prayer, are those prayers which are spontaneous. Screwtape tells Wormwood, you need to teach the patient to judge the worth of a prayer by whether it's able to sort of produce a vaguely devotional mood. A mood that is utterly unrelated to intelligence or will. What Screwtape is saying here is, you need to get this guy to the point where he thinks of prayer essentially as drumming up or working up a certain set of feelings in himself, and that his prayer life will not involve his mind or his will at all. It'll simply be a mass of feelings. Now, if the patient does actually end up praying, something can be done about that too. And that is, Screwtape tells Wormwood, if he actually gets to the point of praying, what you need to do is you need to turn his attention away from God and back to his own feelings and ideas. That is, once again, prayer becomes not really a genuine encounter with God, but prayer becomes the attempt to work up a certain devotional mood or spiritual sensibility in that time. Here's what Screwtape says. The simplest way is to turn their gaze away from him toward themselves. Keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings there by the actions of their own wills. Teach them to estimate the value of each prayer by their success in producing the desired feeling. And you can see where this is going. Over time, right, not all of us are going to feel deeply warm and deeply religious. And eventually, right, the patient is going to get the idea, gosh, I find that not every time I pray, I have like a warm feeling. Maybe that suggests that prayer doesn't work. And so the patient leaves off the habit of prayer. So judge the value of prayer by the feelings that come with it. Make sure that there's no attention paid to God at all. And that's the best way to undermine prayer. The best way to undermine prayer is to make sure that the people who are praying are thinking primarily of their own thoughts and their own feelings, not on God. So here's how this might work, as Screwtape notes. Teach him to value those times when he's come to God to confess his sins, not in actually receiving God's forgiveness, but feeling forgiven. That is, he's to ask himself the question, okay, do I feel forgiven? Not, does God forgive me? This can sort of undermine one's whole prayer life over time. Screwtape notes this. The humans do not start from that direct perception of him, which we, unhappily, cannot avoid. They've never known that ghastly luminosity, that stabbing and searing glare, which makes the background of permanent pain to our lives. That is, Screwtape says, as those who are resisting God, the glorious presence of the Creator forms the permanent background of suffering for our lives. We cannot not pay attention to God. But God doesn't force human beings to pay attention to Him. And that's because what He wants from them is not simply their obedience, but their love. Screwtape says that prayer needs to be undermined because it can be very dangerous. Prayer, genuine prayer, Screwtape says, opens up the possibility of God's immediate action in someone's life. And that, of course, is what hell does not want. Once the patient has come to trust in God, even when he doesn't feel that presence, Screwtape says, our cause is lost. Whenever human beings come to God and stand with their souls exposed to Him in prayer, whenever human beings come and continue to trust in God, even when they don't feel warm and fuzzy, then hell is lost and another soul has slipped through its hands. Letter 5 has to do with the perils of war. And of course, this would have been a very relevant subject given when the Screwtape Letters was published during the Second World War. I think what the letter says is still relevant to us today. Screwtape identifies the works of the fruits of his labor as anguish and the bewilderment of the human soul. That is, Screwtape notes right from the beginning that what tempters are after, what they literally feed on, is the anguish and the bewilderment of human souls. Now, Wormwood thinks that because this is all taking place during a war, that this is sort of a wonderful situation for hell. But Screwtape says that's not necessarily the case. So let's see why. Screwtape notes that war can actually work to heaven's advantage, really for two reasons. The first is that war can actually have the effect of focusing people's attention beyond themselves. And that certainly happened during the Second World War in Britain. People had to begin focusing on neighbors, on their fellow citizens, on the survival of the nation. And so from Screwtape's perspective, a war could actually work against hell's purposes by getting people out of themselves and by focusing them on other people and maybe reawakening their awareness of God. The second reason why war is not necessarily a good thing from hell's perspective is that war places before people the possibility of their own death. That is, war confronts people, or can confront people, with a knowledge of their own mortality. And that can get people thinking about the meaning of their lives. And that's what hell does not want. Hell wants to avoid that at all costs. Screwtape then says something I think that's very insightful. And here we want to remember, this is written back in the 1940s. What's said here I think is even more true today than it was when it was written. Screwtape says that hell would actually prefer people not to die in war, where they might have to think about other people and where they might have to think about the meaning of their lives. Hell would prefer people to die in costly and comfortable nursing homes, where they would have all kinds of opportunities to actually avoid thinking about mortality, where all their sort of quirks and demands were simply indulged. In other words, from hell's perspective, it's actually better for people to live in an atmosphere of kind of contented worldliness than it is for them to face difficulty. Because to face difficulty is to confront the possibility of mortality, to begin thinking about one's own failures and one's own sins, and also to begin thinking about one's obligations to other people. And that is what hell cannot tolerate, and that's what it seeks to prevent with all its power. Oddly enough, therefore, hell would actually prefer people to die and also to live in a situation of kind of comfortableness, a kind of contented worldliness where all thoughts of death were kind of put off and put off and put off. The letter ends with another important point by Screwtape. Screwtape says that, a Christian faith that was destroyed by the reality of war really isn't worth destroying. Because, as he notes, Christianity holds that suffering is part of redemption. Christianity holds that suffering is actually part of redemption, and that someone whose faith collapses in the face of suffering must really not have had a genuine faith in the first place.